This is concerning Acts 21. So let's look at Acts 21. In every single Bible, because the manuscript, the earliest I could get the manuscript back to is something like a 5th century Acts manuscript, which was probably from Egypt, I think, when I looked into it. And I've tried to look into the source of the corruption, but ultimately there were some people like Sean Griffin were using Acts 21 to justify this kind of so-called Torah observant Hebrew roots. And I did some videos either last year or the year before basically saying that if you read the context of Acts 21, it makes no sense whatsoever, especially as well if you use a concordance to go into the epistles of Paul, where he teaches about circumcision being of no use to you. Christ will be of none effect if you are circumcised, which is Galatians. But Acts 21, particularly verses 23 to 26, I believe are entirely corrupt. And I guess, my best guess is that they were added by people who are like the believing Pharisees who caused the apostasy in Antioch. It really points to sects like the Nazarenes, because throughout Acts you'll realise, you'll notice that there are Nazarene sort of Nazarene things going on in Acts, particularly where Paul shaves his head. That would be, very strange. Also, we can go into that. I'll go into that, a bit later. But this is from my translation of the New Testament, where I'm looking to take out the corruptions and provide a version which would have been more like the original New Testament, as far as I can tell. But if we look into the flow of Acts, it starts really at verse 17 here, where it says Paul's arrival at Jerusalem. So if I read Acts 21 from 17 onwards, so it says, "Now of our having arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. And on the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders arrived, and having greeted them, he began to relate, one by each, the things God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry." So Paul's basically saying, we went to Asia Minor, we went to Rome, we did these signs and wonders, we preached the gospel, they persecuted us, but God delivered us, and we taught the New Testament, and we converted whole peoples to the gospel, and we've set up churches in these cities, and they now believe in the cross, and we've ordained bishops and deacons. And this is the kind of thing he was saying, right, in verse 17, okay? Going into verse 20, it says, "And those having heard began glorifying God, and they said to him, 'You see, brother, how many myriads there are among the Jews having believed, and they are all zealous ones for the law. Now they've been informed about you that you teach all Jews among the Gentiles apostasy from Moses, telling them not to circumcise the children, nor to walk in the customs. What then is it? Certainly they will hear that you have come.'" Now when I was thinking about these verses, initially I thought these verses are probably corrupted as well, because it kind of sets it up as like you could think it's setting it up like some kind of negative, like you're teaching all the Jews to forsake the law and the teachings of Moses, etc. But I actually think these verses could be the original. But as we'll go into 23, this could start making sense. But ultimately, the Christians in Jerusalem are saying, we have a lot of Jews who are staying under the law, the Old Testament law, but they do believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay, so telling them not to circumcise the children, correct, and don't walk in the customs, correct. And then 22 is kind of vague. It says, what then is it? Certainly they will hear that you've come. Kind of like, they're going to find out you're here. You're teaching an anti-Mosaic doctrine. They're going to find out you're here. What are we going to do? So we go into verse 23. This is entitled, in my version, redacted Nazarite verses. I'm calling this. So these are the three corrupt verses, or four, should I say? Okay, 23 is, therefore do this. This is in every Bible. Therefore do this, that we say to you, with us there are 4 men having a vow on themselves, having taken these men. I mean, this is strange in itself. Why would the Christians have 4 men with them who are following Mosaic, temple-based law? Because we know that these two schisms, okay, the Christians are not a schism, but we know that these two religions were now separate. With us are 4 men having a vow on themselves, having taken these men, be purified with them, and bear expense for them, so that they will shave the head, and all will know that of which they have been informed about you is nothing. But you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. Absolute crazy to think that's in every single Bible. I mean, if you look at what 23 and 4 are saying, apparently the Christians in Jerusalem are saying that if you take these 4 men, you can prove to all those who keep the law in Jerusalem that all your acts that you've done in Asia Minor, in Rome, where you've converted all these Christians from the Gentiles and also from the synagogues of the Jews, that none of that, it's all nothing, because you don't do that. You actually are a law observant Jew, and you walk in the law of Moses. You don't do this new Christian thing where you preach the cross and you convert sinners and baptize them and they receive the Holy Spirit. You don't do any of that. You're a Torah observant Jew. This is what verse 23 and 24 is saying. It's completely heretical and blasphemous. So going to 25, it says, now concerning those of the Gentiles having believed, we wrote, having adjudged them to keep from both the things offered to idols, blood, what is strangled, and sexual immorality. Then Paul, having taken the men on the following day, having been purified with them, entered into the temple, declaring the fulfillment of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So 26 basically. So 25 says, Gentiles don't have to do any of this law observant Jew stuff. They just have these basic Gentile laws, which is like abstain from idols and the food to the idols and eating blood and what's strangled and fornications, sexual immoralities, adulteries, etc. But 26 is then saying, but Paul goes with these 4 men and goes into the temple of Jerusalem and purifies himself according to the Nazarite vow, which is in Numbers, till the sacrifice. So this is animal sacrifices being offered for each one of them. So afterwards, before I read the alternate acts, right, what then goes on as you would progress from here is Paul is seized in the temple. Why is Paul seized in the temple if he's being a Torah observant Jew? Why is he seized? So 27 kicks off saying, now when the 7 days were about to be completed, the Jews from Asia, having seen him in the temple, began stirring up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, men, Israelites, help. This is the man teaching all those everywhere against the people and the law of this place. So 28 is saying that the Jews were saying, this Paul is against us. He teaches everybody to forsake the law and this place, i.e. the temple. But like we just read in 26 how he he was in the temple doing all those sacrifices. And besides, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and defiled his holy place. So again, this from 27 onwards, that's not corrupt. But we see from 23 through to 26 is entirely out of context of that chapter and it doesn't work. So I was working with AI, and we basically I asked it what in the context of the epistles of Paul and the context of Acts 21 from verse 1 to 22 and then from 27 onwards, in that he sees what could he really have said after the where verse 21 and 2 say that the Christians said, you know, all these Jews who keep the Mosaic law know that you're telling them that you're teaching apostasy from the law of Moses, that you shouldn't circumcise your children, walk in the customs, but they're going to know you're here, right? So the reply to this unnamed Christian could be imagined, because I put here alternate Acts, reimagined text. We can only imagine what he would have said, because that particular passage of text is obviously gone forever because it's been corrupted. But could it have said this? So from 23, then Paul answered and said, I have not come to uphold the law which is passing away, but to proclaim the better covenant which is established upon better promises. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes, and in him the shadows have found their fulfillment. Verse 24, let them who are under the law remain there if they cannot yet receive the Spirit, but we preach liberty to all who are in Christ. And as for the Gentiles who have believed, they are not bound to keep the ordinances of Moses, for we have not laid upon them such a yoke. And Paul departed from them and continued to speak boldly in the synagogues, reasoning daily that Jesus is the Christ and the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So if we carry on reading now into 27, subtitled Paul is seized in the temple, and it goes, now when the 7 days were about to be completed, the Jews from Asia, having seen him in the temple, began stirring up the whole crowd and laid hands upon him, crying out, men, Israelites, help, this is the man teaching all those everywhere against the people and the law of this place. And besides, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and defiled the holy place. That works so much better in the context of the chapter. It's completely undeniable that works, because you have up to verse 26. Paul, as we said here, Paul arrives in Jerusalem. He tells the Christians about all the acts that he's done, and they glorify God, and they say, well, we've got loads of believers here, but they don't forsake the law, basically, and you're teaching everybody to forsake the law. And then we go into this idea of the Jews and Gentiles, but ultimately there is no difference. As it says, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. They've all been called into Christianity, and the ones who couldn't come into Christianity were locked up under the law. So, I mean, what do you think about this alternate Acts 21, 23 to 26? Because in the version that I was going to present as the New Testament, I've kept in the original, which is here, and I've put in a reimagined version of what would have been a more deliberate, a more honest, a more likely version. I particularly like 23, the immediate answer, because as it says, I've not come to uphold the law which is passing away, but to proclaim the better covenant which is established on better promises, because the New Testament was a more glorious covenant. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes, and in him the shadows have found their fulfillment. I mean, I think that's fantastic. That bit where it says, in him the shadows have found their fulfillment. You know, it fits in with the Colossians, where it says, let no man judge you in terms of meats, drinks, holy days and Sabbaths, which are a shadow, but the body is Christ. So that is basically the meat and potatoes of this video. Let's just see, check the live stream. Okay, that's fine. Might just go through the introduction according to this now that we've seen the okay, the Nazarite rewrite. Let's see what we got here. This is from the introduction. The Nazarite rewrite, how Acts was reshaped by a law-keeping sect. Let's get it over here. Okay, the Acts of the Apostles presents a version of Paul that often stands in contradiction to the Paul found in his own letters. While Paul fiercely defends freedom from the law in Galatians, Romans and Philippians, Acts depicts him submitting to circumcision, temple vows and purification rites. The inconsistency is not merely theological, it's textual. It suggests that the manuscript tradition behind Acts may have been influenced by an early Jewish Christian sect, possibly Nazarites or their successors. These communities, which upheld Torah observance even after accepting Jesus as Messiah, may have reshaped Paul's story to fit their version of law-abiding messianic movement. This chapter explores that possibility. The sectarian context: Nazarites, Nazarenes and Ebionites. Early Christianity was not monolithic. Alongside Pauline churches preaching salvation by grace, other communities held tightly to the law of Moses, and among these were Nazarites, Torah loyal, ascetic and temple orientated, tracing their tradition to Numbers 6. Nazarenes, Jewish followers of Jesus who upheld the law, documented by Epiphanius. And then Ebionites viewed Paul as an apostate and insisted on circumcision and Mosaic law. These groups often opposed Paul's gospel of law-free Gentile inclusion. Some, like the Ebionites, rejected Paul outright. Others sought to, in brackets, rehabilitate him, not to destroy his legacy, but to edit his image to match their own convictions. And like, here's the thing with the canon, is this corruption would have happened before canon, because before the 4th century you just had manuscripts. They were single papyrus titles, and you could basically, if you were a sect, you could pick and choose your own canon. So people like the Encratites, Ebionites, they rejected all of Paul's epistles. So this particular sect, whoever corrupted it, my opinion is this is their version. And they would have had, for their disciples that they've deceived, they would have just provided them with the manuscript of the Acts of the Apostles, and they probably wouldn't have been privy to any of Paul's epistles to see the contradictions. But we can see them clearly because we have this canonical order. Second part, Acts as a redacted narrative. The version of Acts we have today may reflect a composite tradition, one that tries to reconcile Paul with Judaizing. In doing so, it introduces key contradictions, especially around Torah observance. So we have Acts 16:3, Paul circumcises Timothy. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him. Okay, Acts 16:3. Contradiction, Galatians 5:2. If you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Implication, either Paul is violating his own gospel, or this episode is a later addition by redactors who needed to show Paul acting in accordance with Jewish expectations. This act makes sense only if the redactor wished to soften Paul's perceived lawlessness. Okay, point B. Acts 18:18, Paul shaves his head because of a vow. The verse, at Cenchrea he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow. This passage likely refers to a Nazarite vow, referenced in Numbers 6:1-5, a deeply Jewish ritual involving hair, purity and temple sacrifice. Contradiction, Paul never mentions such vows in his letters, quite the opposite. In Philippians 3 he calls his former righteousness under the law rubbish. Why would he return to it? Implication, this action aligns perfectly with Nazarite sensibilities and may be a direct insertion from a law-keeping redactor or community. Acts, point C, Acts 21:20-26, which we've just shown. Paul purifies himself in the temple. You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed and are all zealous for the law. Here, James asks Paul to demonstrate his loyalty to the law by joining 4 men under a vow, likely Nazarites, and purifying himself in the temple. Contradiction. Galatians 2 describes a radically different Paul, one who openly confronts Peter and refuses to submit to the law. He even says, if I rebuild what I destroyed, then I really would be a lawbreaker. Galatians 2:18. Implication, Acts 21 presents Paul not just as observant, but submissive to the authority of a bogus Judaizing Jerusalem church and letter of the Torah. This may reflect an intentional reworking by a sect that sought to harmonize Paul with a law-observant false Christ. Okay, 3. A redactional agenda. Why recast Paul? The redaction of Acts was not arbitrary. The agenda seems to have been to preserve Paul's missionary model but correct his theology, to neutralize conflict between Paul and James, to uphold Torah observance for Jewish believers in Jesus. This would explain why Acts avoids quoting Galatians, sidesteps Paul's arguments against the law, and instead depicts him as a Torah-respecting emissary, even at personal cost. Such redaction fits well with a Nazarene or Ebionite influence, especially if they were among the custodians of certain manuscript traditions. Number 4, reclaiming the original Paul. By comparing Acts to the authentic Pauline epistles, we can begin to strip away these layers of redaction. What emerges is a Paul who boasts in the cross, not circumcision, declares the law abolished in Christ, Ephesians 2:15, considers Torah righteousness obsolete, Romans 10:4. This Paul stands in contradiction to the Paul of Acts 21 unless we accept that the latter portrayal is a result of a Nazarite rewrite. Conclusion. The Acts of the Apostles, far from being a neutral history, bears the marks of theological editing. In particular, it appears to reflect the priorities of an early Jewish Christian sect who could not accept a Paul divorced from the law. They did not erase Paul, they apostatized him. But in doing so, they left behind a fractured narrative where the apostate of grace becomes a Nazarite by compulsion. Recognizing this opens the door to a true understanding of early Christianity, one where Paul's voice can finally speak without distortion. Okay, so going into there, let's just look at what else I wrote, just in case. Just kind of, I won't want to repeat myself, but I mean, this is important. 2 Corinthians 3, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Ultimately, this was why, this was why, and this is why the law is misunderstood, because they follow the letter of the law, which is a literal interpretation. That's what it means by the letter kills. A literal interpretation of the law kills. Because there is an element of parable, it's shadow and not light, etc. Like, for example, Dietary law is parabolic. It stands for people. Do not be like certain people. It likens them to animals. But the Jews believed it was to do with a literal eating. And the shadow is for a recognition. If I was to stand to the side and you could see my profile upon a wall, but you couldn't see my face, but the light was casting a shadow onto the wall from my profile, and I have a certain profile, then you, having seen the shadow only of my profile, you might be able to recognize my face afterwards from the profile shadow. And that is what basically the Old Testament is. It's a profile shadow of Christ. But they couldn't recognize the profile from the shadow, shall we say, if you understand what I'm saying. So this is this reimagining of Acts 21 that I wanted to share. I'm pretty happy with it. It's from this Anti-Nicene New Testament that I've been working on, called Before the Bible, translation from Codex Sinaiticus with early canon fragments. It's got some other good things in there which I'm going to go into, which is the Theologion, which is a manuscript which includes an extra verse or two from Mark 16, post-resurrection. It's going to be great, basically, is what I'm saying. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that reimagined version. So let me know in the comments if you get to see. But that's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.